Leave this school immediately, or you will regret it.
A teacher, mocked by her colleagues for believing in her students, decides to prove them all wrong. But she doesn't argue, and she doesn't complain. Her revenge is far more clever, using the one thing they mocked her for, the state exam itself, to deliver a lesson they will never, ever forget. If you're on the edge of your seat, make sure you're here for the next story. Subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for more. Now, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Comment your city name below. The stale, bitter smell of old coffee and photocopier toner hung heavy in the teacher's lounge, a familiar scent that usually brought a strange sort of comfort to Lena. But today, it felt suffocating. She stood by the window, her back to the room, pretending to be engrossed in the view of the empty soccer field. Behind her, the conversation continued, a low hum of voices that she had learned to tune out until her name sliced through the noise. Lena's kids? Oh, please. They're just not built for that kind of material. It's not her fault, really. It's just their background, you know? The voice belonged to Brenda from the history department, a woman who wore too much perfume and spoke with a syrupy sweetness that never reached her eyes. A grunt of agreement followed. She gives them these complex novels, expects them to discuss themes and motifs. It's a waste of time. They need basic grammar drills. But what can you do? She has her methods. That was David, the math teacher, his tone dripping with a condescension he didn't even try to hide. Lena's fingers tightened around the warm ceramic of her mug. She could feel their eyes on her back, waiting for a reaction, hoping for one. She took a slow, silent breath, the kind she taught her students to take before a big test. In holdout, she would not give them the satisfaction. This wasn't the first time. The comments were always veiled, just enough to be mean, but never direct enough to report. Their background, her methods, code words. They were all just code words. The worst part was the laughing. A soft, agreeing chuckle rippled through the small group. It was the sound of complicity, the sound that made her feel utterly alone in a room full of people who were supposed to be her colleagues. She turned around, a calm, neutral mask perfectly fixed on her face. The conversation stopped abruptly. Brenda offered a tight, false smile. David suddenly found the stack of papers in his hand very interesting. Lena, dear, Brenda chirped. We were just talking about the midterm exam results. Your class's averages were, well, they were quite a bit lower than the others. Again, I'm aware, Lena said, her voice even, betraying none of the storm raging inside her. We're focusing on depth of understanding, not just test scores. It was the truth, but it sounded weak even to her own ears, a feeble defense against their smug certainty. David snorted. Depth is great, Lena, but the state tests are multiple choice. You're not doing them any favors by filling their heads with poetry when they can't identify a noun. The bell rang, a shrill electric scream that saved her from having to form a reply. She gave a curt nod, placed her untouched coffee on the counter, and walked out, her head held high. The hallway was suddenly flooded with the chaotic energy of students, a wave of shouting and shuffling backpacks. The noise was a welcome shield. She retreated to her classroom, her sanctuary. The walls were covered in posters of authors like Maya Angelou and James Baldwin, quotes about the power of words and the importance of finding your own voice. It felt like a cruel joke now. Her own voice felt so small, so ineffective. The rest of the day passed in a blur of forced smiles and patient explanations of Shakespearean sonnets to rows of sometimes eager, sometimes bored teenage faces. But in the back of her mind, a single cold thought was crystallizing. This had to stop. She was tired of the quiet disrespect, the patronizing advice, the way they dismissed her students, her brilliant, struggling, wonderful students, as lost causes. They saw test scores. She saw potential, and they mocked her for it. That evening, in the quiet of her small apartment, the humiliation replayed on a loop. She sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp pushing back the darkness, and stared at the district's standardized test score reports spread out before her. The numbers were indeed low, but they weren't low because her kids weren't smart. They were low because the test asked all the wrong questions. It asked about obscure vocabulary words they'd never encountered in passages from authors who didn't reflect a single one of their lived experiences. A plan began to form, not in a flash of anger, but with a slow, chilling clarity. It was a dangerous idea, one that could cost her everything, her job, her reputation. But the memory of their laughter, the sheer injustice of it, burned away the fear. She wouldn't yell. She wouldn't complain to the principal again. That was what they expected. That was what they could easily dismiss. No, her revenge would be far sweeter, far more complete. She would use the very thing they mocked her for, her methods. She would use the power of words. She opened her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined face. She began to research, not lesson plans, but the state's standardized testing blueprints, the specific rules proctors had to follow, the exact formatting requirements for answer sheets. She cross-referenced this with the school's academic calendar, the dates of the upcoming state assessments, the schedule for the teacher training day that was mandatory for all staff the week before the tests. For the next few weeks, Lena was a model of professionalism. She attended the pointless meetings. She nodded politely at Brenda's inane suggestions. She even complimented David on his department's math league victory. All the while, she was working. Her real work happened late at night, long after the last student had gone home, when the school was empty and silent. She started a new unit with her senior English class, the one everyone said was too difficult for them. It was on critical thinking and media literacy. On the surface, it was perfectly aligned with the curriculum. She taught them how to deconstruct arguments, identify logical fallacies, and understand subtext. She taught them that every piece of writing, every test, every set of instructions was created by a person with a point of view, and that point of view could be analyzed, questioned, and even exploited. The world is full of codes, she told them one afternoon, her voice passionate. Some are meant to include you, and some are meant to keep you out. Your job is to learn how to break them, to read not just what is written, but what is meant, what is hidden. Her students, initially skeptical, were captivated. She was talking about real things, things that mattered. She used examples from social media, from advertising, from political speeches. They were engaged in a way they had never been before, their discussions lively and insightful. They had no idea they were being prepared for something else entirely. The final piece of her plan required a small, calculated risk. On the teacher training day, a Friday when the students were off, the entire faculty was herded into the auditorium for a day of lectures on new assessment strategies. It was during the mid-morning coffee break that Lena saw her opportunity. The main office was empty, the administrative staff enjoying their break elsewhere. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and resolve. This was it. No going back. She slipped inside, her footsteps silent on the tile floor. She knew exactly where they kept the master key, the one that opened the storage closet where the sealed boxes of next week's state tests were being held under lock and key. She also knew the security camera in the main office was a dummy, a hollow plastic dome she'd confirmed was empty weeks ago. With hands that trembled only slightly, she retrieved the key from its hook, her ears straining for any sound of approaching footsteps. The hallway was still quiet. She moved quickly to the closet, unlocked it, and found the box she needed. It was sealed with heavy-duty tape and bold red warnings that said, "Contents secure. Do not open until day of testing." She didn't open it. She didn't need to. From her pocket, she pulled a small, ordinary-looking box of paper clips. But these were not ordinary. She had spent the previous night meticulously bending and shaping them, creating a set of delicate, precise tools. She worked one of these tools under the edge of the heavy tape, applying careful pressure. It was a slow, painstaking process, but eventually she was able to peel the tape back just enough to slide the test booklets out without tearing the packaging. She left the answer sheets untouched. They were not her target. Back in her empty classroom, with the door locked, she finally allowed herself to breathe. She laid the test booklets on her desk. The State English Language Arts Assessment for grade 12. She spent the next hour not memorizing the questions, but studying the structure, the format. the specific wording of the instructions, the exact number of questions in each section. Then, with the same care, she resealed the box, using a roll of identical heavy-duty tape she had brought from home. She returned the box to the closet, locked it, and hung the master key back on its hook in the main office. The entire operation had taken less than 20 minutes. She rejoined the training session in the auditorium, slipping into a seat in the back row just as the next speaker was being introduced. No one noticed her absence. No one ever really noticed her at all. The following Monday, the test began. The school was hushed, a tense silence blanketing the hallways. Lena proctored her own exam room, watching her students bent over their booklets, their pencils scratching furiously. They looked just like every other student in the building, focused and serious. But they were different. They were armed. She had never explicitly told them what was on the test. That would have been cheating, and she would never do that. Instead, during those weeks of critical thinking lessons, she had drilled them on specific, seemingly random skills. She had them practice filling out countless sample answer sheets, not with correct answers, but with a specific pattern of shading the bubbles. Completely dark, no stray marks, the pencil held at a precise 45-degree angle to avoid a shine that the scanning machines might misread. She had spent an entire class period on a seemingly bizarre exercise, reading instructions aloud, word for word, and then discussing every possible meaning of each word. What does select mean? Does it mean guess? Does it mean choose the first answer that looks good? Or what does it mean to carefully eliminate wrong choices until only the right one remains? They had laughed, but they had done it. And most importantly, she had taught them about the distractors, the wrong answers on a multiple-choice test. The people who make these tests, she had said, they are clever. They will put answers that look right if you're reading too fast. They will use words that sound smart but mean nothing. Your job is to see the traps. Your job is to be more clever than they are. Now, as her students worked through the actual exam, they saw it. The instructions were exactly as Ms. Jenkins had described them, down to the smallest comma. The question formats were familiar from her practice drills. The distractors were obvious now, glaringly out of place to eyes that had been trained to look for them. They weren't taking a test. They were solving a puzzle for which their teacher had given them the key. They worked with a quiet confidence that was entirely new to them. Lena watched them, a small, secret smile touching her lips for the first time in months. The revenge was not in changing the test. The revenge was in changing her students. She had given them the tools to dismantle the very system designed to make them fail. She had taken the thing she was mocked for, her belief in their depth, their critical thinking, and weaponized it. The results, she knew, would speak for themselves. And when they did, the laughter in the teacher's lounge would finally, forever, be silenced. Weeks bled into one another, the initial post-test relief in the school hardening into a familiar, weary routine. The giant standardized testing machine had finished its grind, and now the waiting began. For most teachers, it was a period of low-grade anxiety, a hope that their students had performed adequately to avoid scrutiny from the district office. For Lena, it was a period of perfect practice calm. She moved through her days with a serene detachment that seemed to unnerve her colleagues more than any sign of stress would have. She taught her classes with a renewed passion, her students responding with an engagement that was noticeably deeper, more thoughtful. They had shared a secret, unspoken mission, and the success of it had bonded them in a way that was almost palpable. Brenda from history, however, seemed incapable of letting the topic die. The teacher's lounge remained her stage. "I just don't know what they were thinking with some of the literature passages this year," she announced one lunchtime, stirring a packet of sugar into her coffee with a little too much force. "So obscure. My kids were completely lost. I'm sure they guessed on half of it." David nodded sagely. A man who believed his math expertise gave him insight into every subject. "It's a flawed model. The data sets they pull from are inherently biased toward a certain demographic. It's simple statistics. Other groups are just going to naturally underperform. It's not a reflection on the teaching." He said this last part while glancing pointedly in Lena's direction, as if offering her a generous excuse. Lena simply took a sip of her tea, saying nothing. Her silence was a wall they could not scale. It frustrated them, this lack of reaction. They were baiting a hook, but the fish had not only swum away. It seemed to have found a better, more interesting pond entirely. The first crack in the normalcy appeared not with a bang, but with an email. It was sent late on a Tuesday afternoon, a routine district-wide memo about professional development opportunities. But at the very bottom, below the signature, was a single, intriguing line. Preliminary embargoed state assessment data will be available to principals this Thursday. School-level reports to follow next week. Lena read the line once, then again. A slow, deep breath filled her lungs. The waiting was almost over. She closed her email and looked out at her now-empty classroom. The posters of Baldwin and Angelou seemed to watch her back, their printed eyes seeming to hold a knowing glint. On Thursday, she noticed the change immediately. The principal, Mr. Davies, a man usually fond of long, meandering walks through the hallways, was conspicuously absent. His office door was closed all day. When he did emerge, his face was pale, his expression a peculiar mix of confusion and dawning, bewildered excitement. He walked quickly, his eyes fixed straight ahead, not stopping to chat with anyone. The next day, the whispers started. They began in the main office, with the secretaries who had seen the printed reports on Mr. Davies's desk. They spread to the department heads who had been summoned for a brief, cryptic meeting. The whispers were hushed, confused, and utterly unbelievable. They spoke of a historic anomaly, a statistical impossibility. They spoke of perfect scores. By Monday morning, the air in the building was electric with a tense, unspoken curiosity. The official school-wide reports were due to be distributed in the afternoon staff meeting. The usual pre-meeting chatter in the auditorium was subdued, replaced by a low hum of speculation. Brenda and David sat together, as always, their heads close. "I heard it's a mistake," Brenda muttered, her voice barely audible. "A glitch in the scanning software. They said Jenkins's kids, well, they said they all passed. Every single one. And not just passed. Aced it." David shook his head, a dismissive scowl on his face. "Impossible. Her kids were bottom of the barrel. There has to be an error. Probably mixed up the labels with the gifted magnet school's tests. It'll be corrected." The door opened and Mr. Davies walked in, followed by his vice principals. Their faces were unreadable. He carried a thick stack of papers. The room fell completely silent. He didn't bother with his usual pleasantries or jokes. He placed the stack on the podium and looked out at the staff, his gaze sweeping over them, lingering for a fraction of a second on Lena, who sat perfectly still in the back row. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice unusually gravelly. "I have here the summary reports for the state assessments. As you know, these scores are used for state accountability, for funding allocations, and for our own internal review of curriculum and instruction." He paused, choosing his words with obvious care. "This year's results are remarkable. In many ways, they are unprecedented in the history of this school, and from what the district tells me, in the entire state." He started with the math scores. They were fine. Average. Exactly as expected. Then science. Also average. Social studies. A slight dip, but nothing alarming. A few teachers shifted in their seats. The anticipation was a physical weight in the room. Then he picked up the last report. He cleared his throat. "And now, for the English Language Arts assessment for grade 12. He looked down at the paper, and for a long moment, he said nothing. The silence stretched, becoming uncomfortable. "The state average proficiency rate was 54%, he said, his voice flat. The district average was 58%. Our school average." He stopped again, looking up as if he still couldn't believe what he was about to say. "Our school average was 91%. A collective, sharp intake of breath echoed in the auditorium. 91%. It was a number from a fantasy. Brenda's mouth had dropped open. David was leaning forward, his brow furrowed in intense confusion. "But that's not all," Mr. Davies continued, his eyes once again finding Lena's in the back. She held his gaze, her expression one of polite interest. "The average score for Ms. Jenkins's second period English class," he swallowed, "was 100%. Not a single student in that class scored less than perfect. Every answer on every test for every student was correct. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a void of sound, thick and disbelieving. All heads turned, slowly as one, to look at Lena. She did not smile. She did not flinch. She merely offered a small, humble shrug, as if to say, "I'm as surprised as you are." Brenda was the first to break. "That's impossible." The words burst from her, loud and shrill in the quiet room. "There has to be a mistake, a computer error. Those children, her class, they're not capable of that." The veiled comments were gone now, replaced by naked, sputtering disbelief. Mr. Davies's face hardened. "The tests have been verified. The answer sheets were scanned 3 times. The state is sending their own auditors next week because they don't believe it either. But the data is correct. The scores stand." The meeting dissolved into chaos. Teachers began talking all at once, their voices overlapping in a cacophony of shock and suspicion. Accusations of cheating began to fly, not directly at Lena yet, but in hushed, urgent tones all around her. They suggested stolen answer keys, that she must have told them the answers, that the whole thing was a massive, fraudulent scheme. Through it all, Lena remained silent. She watched them unravel, these colleagues who had been so sure of her failure, so certain of her students' limitations. Their confusion was a balm. Their panic was a symphony. This was the first shock, the tremor before the earthquake. They thought the story was about cheating. They were looking for a simple, sordid explanation because their minds could not comprehend the alternative, that the black teacher they had mocked and her so-called hopeless students had simply been smarter than the test. Smarter than them. Mr. Davies finally called for order, his voice booming over the din. "Enough. The scores are what they are. We will, of course, cooperate fully with the state's investigation. But until then, I suggest we all focus on the remarkable achievement of our students." His words were meant to calm, but they only fueled the frenzy. An investigation. The word hung in the air, toxic and thrilling. As the staff filed out of the auditorium, the looks directed at Lena were no longer just of disbelief. They were dark with suspicion and a new, simmering fear. She had done the impossible, and in their world, the impossible was always a trick. They just had to figure out how she'd done it. They didn't know that the real trick, the true revenge, was that she hadn't done anything wrong at all. She had only taught her children to see the world and the test for what it really was. And that was a power they could never understand and could never take away. The following week was a study in quiet, simmering tension. The school, usually buzzing with the uncomplicated noise of adolescence, felt like a hell breath. The state auditors had arrived, 2 severe-looking individuals in sharp suits who set up a temporary office in the conference room next to the principal's. Their presence was a silent alarm that echoed through the hallways. Every teacher felt watched, but all eyes, both curious and accusing, were fixed on Lena. She became an island of unnerving calm in a sea of frantic speculation. The investigation was thorough and intrusive. The auditors pulled student records, comparing past grades and attendance with the miraculous test scores. They interviewed teachers, their questions polite but pointed. They asked about Lena's teaching methods, her lesson plans, her classroom management. Brenda and David were only too happy to offer their opinions, their voices laced with a false concern that barely concealed their glee at the prospect of her downfall. "She spends far too much time on abstract concepts," Brenda told the auditors, her hands folded primly on the table. "Critical thinking, she calls it. But it seems to me she's not teaching them the fundamentals they need for the test." David was more direct. "Her class averages have always been the lowest in the department. This result isn't an improvement. It's an impossibility. The data doesn't lie." Well, it usually doesn't. He left the accusation hanging in the air, a poisonous cloud. Through it all, Lena was the picture of cooperative professionalism. She provided her lesson plans, which were meticulously detailed and perfectly aligned with the curriculum standards. She explained her critical thinking unit with a patient passion that made the auditors listen intently. She spoke about her students not as statistics, but as individuals with unique potentials. She never once grew defensive. Her confidence was a fortress. The real masterstroke, however, was her students. The auditors pulled them from their classes for individual interviews. They asked subtle, tricky questions, trying to catch them in a lie, to find a crack in the story. One student, Jamal, who had struggled with reading his entire life, was asked about a particularly complex vocabulary word on the test. Ubiquitous? He said, repeating the word. Yeah, that was on there. It means everywhere, present all over the place. Like, social media is ubiquitous in our lives. The auditor, surprised, asked how he knew that. Jamal shrugged. Ms. Jenkins, she doesn't just give us a list of words. She makes us break them down, find the roots. Ubique is like from Latin for everywhere. You see that root, you can figure out. It's a code. Another student, Chloe, was questioned about a reading passage from an obscure 19th century essay. The author's main argument was flawed because of a false dilemma, she explained calmly. He presented only two choices when there were clearly other alternatives. Ms. Jenkins taught us to look for logical fallacies. They're like traps in the text. One by one, the students parroted back the very lessons Lena had embedded in their minds. They spoke of deconstruction, of subtext, of identifying an author's bias. They talked about test-taking as a game of strategy. Not one of them mentioned a specific test question. Not one of them said anything about an answer key. They simply demonstrated convincingly and authentically that they had learned to think in a deeper, more analytical way. The auditors were left frustrated and deeply impressed. These were not the responses of kids who had cheated. These were the responses of kids who genuinely understood the material on a profound level. Meanwhile, the atmosphere among the staff grew darker, more paranoid. The initial shock had curdled into a bitter resentment. Their own mediocre scores were now thrown into sharp relief by Lena's stunning success. The whispers in the lounge were no longer just about Lena. They were about themselves, their own inadequacies reflected in her achievement. It was during one of these hushed gatherings that David, his face pale and serious, shared a new piece of information he'd heard from a friend at the district office. He leaned in close, his voice a low, ominous rumble. They're not just looking at her, he said. The investigation is widening. They're checking the security logs for the main office. They're looking into who had access to the master key before the tests. A sudden, cold silence fell over the small group. Brenda's eyes went wide. The master key. Everyone knew about it. Everyone knew it was kept in the main office for emergencies. A dozen teachers had access to that office every single day. Why would they be looking into that? Brenda asked, her voice suddenly small. Because, David said, his tone implying he was stating the obvious. If there was a security breach, if someone accessed the tests early, then the blame might not lie solely with one person. There could be collaborators, or, at the very least, a serious failure in protocol that implicates the entire school leadership. The implication was clear and terrifying. If Lena had cheated, she couldn't have done it alone. She would have needed help. Or perhaps her actions had exposed a shocking lack of security that would make the principal and the entire administrative staff look incompetent. The scandal would no longer be contained to one rogue teacher. It would engulf the whole school, tainting everyone. Their own reputations, their own job security were now suddenly on the line. The fear in the room was now palpable, a thick, sour smell. They had been so eager for Lena to be exposed as a fraud, but they had never considered the fallout might splash back on them. Their smug certainty began to evaporate, replaced by a frantic, self-preserving anxiety. They began to look at each other with new suspicion. Who had been in the office late that week? Who had seemed nervous? Brenda, in particular, grew quiet and withdrawn. She was suddenly remembering the teacher training day. She remembered leaving the auditorium to use the restroom. She remembered passing the main office and seeing. What? The door was slightly ajar. Was there someone inside? She couldn't remember. Had it been Lena? The memory was fuzzy, clouded by her own bias. What if she had seen something? What if she was somehow implicated by her own silence? The collective desire for Lena's punishment began to subtly shift. It was no longer about justice or truth. It was about containment. They needed this to go away. They started to hope, quietly and desperately, that the auditors would find nothing. The perfect scores, once an outrage, now seemed like a dangerous mystery that was better left unsolved. Lena watched this shift from a distance, a quiet observer of the chaos she had set in motion. She saw the fear in their eyes, the way they now avoided her, not out of disdain, but out of a superstitious dread. She had not just beaten them on the test. She had held up a mirror to their pettiness and their insecurity, and she had forced them to watch as their own house of cards began to tremble. The sweetest part of her revenge was not their shock at her success, but their terror at the prospect of their own failure being exposed. The trap was no longer just around her. Its walls were closing in on all of them. The day the state auditors presented their findings, the staff meeting was mandatory. There was no chatter beforehand, no rustling of papers or sipping of coffee. The room was a vault of tense silence, every chair occupied by a teacher holding their breath. Mr. Davies stood at the podium, the two auditors flanking him like stone sentinels. Their faces were grim, but not with the anger everyone expected. They looked, instead, profoundly uncomfortable. Lena sat in her usual spot in the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked not at the principal, but at her colleagues. She saw the tight lines around Brenda's mouth, the nervous tap of David's finger on his knee. They were not waiting for her condemnation. They were waiting for their own salvation, hoping the blame would land neatly on her and her alone. Mr. Davies cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud. The investigation is complete, he began, his voice flat and weary. The state auditors have reviewed all evidence, conducted all interviews, and have reached their conclusion regarding the grade 12 ELA assessment scores. He paused, looking down at the report in his hands as if it were written in a language he couldn't understand. They found no evidence of academic dishonesty, no evidence of a leaked answer key, no evidence that Ms. Jenkins provided her students with specific test answers. A wave of disbelief, colder and sharper than the first, washed over the room. Brenda actually shook her head, a quick, jerky motion of denial. David's face flushed a deep, angry red. How is that possible? A voice called out from the middle of the room. It was met with a low murmur of agreement. The lead auditor, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense haircut, stepped forward. "It is possible," she said, her voice crisp and clear, because the students demonstrated a masterful understanding of the skills being assessed. Their interviews were consistent and insightful. They didn't recite answers. They explained process. They discussed textual analysis, logical reasoning, and strategic elimination in a way that is, frankly, exceptional. They were not cheating. They were simply better prepared than any students we have ever encountered. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It was the sound of a worldview shattering. The foundation upon which Brenda, David, and so many others had built their careers, the unshakable belief in the limitations of Lena's students, crumbled into dust beneath their feet. But Mr. Davies wasn't finished. His expression had shifted from weary to something harder, something deeply disappointed. However, he said, and the word hung in the air, a lead weight. The investigation did uncover something else, a serious and concerning breach of professional conduct. Every eye in the room was locked on him. Lena allowed herself a small, inward smile. This was the twist they never saw coming. As part of their review, Mr. Davies continued, his gaze sweeping over the staff. The auditors examined the security system logs, not just for the main office, but for the entire administrative wing. He let that sink in for a moment. The school security system, which we were told was only for the main entrances, was quietly updated over the summer. It includes audio recording capability in the main office and the teacher's lounge, as a pilot program for incident documentation. Very few people were aware of this. The blood drained from Brenda's face. David stopped tapping his knee, his hand freezing in place. The logs show the storage closet was accessed the afternoon of the teacher training day, Mr. Davies said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than a shout. But the master key was not taken. The security footage from the hallway outside is inconclusive. However, the audio recording from inside the main office for that period is very, very clear. He didn't need to play it. He simply recited the words, his voice a cold, dead echo of the conversation that had taken place weeks ago. Lena's kids? Oh, please. They're just not built for that kind of material, their background, you know. He looked directly at Brenda, whose face was now as white as a sheet. Then he turned to David. She gives them these complex novels. It's a waste of time. They need basic grammar drills. But what can you do? She has her methods. He recited their words verbatim, their own petty, cruel remarks hanging in the air for everyone to hear. The room was utterly still. You could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights. This conversation, Mr. Davies said, his voice trembling with a fury he was barely containing, was not an isolated incident. The recordings reveal a pattern of deeply unprofessional, discriminatory, and toxic dialogue from a number of staff members, primarily directed at a colleague and, by extension, her students. He wasn't just talking about the test anymore. He was talking about everything. The years of subtle digs, the veiled racism, the casual cruelty disguised as professional opinion. It was all there, laid bare by their own voices. The issue was never how Ms. Jenkins's students performed, Mr. Davies said, his voice finally rising. The real issue, the failure this investigation uncovered, is the culture of this school. A culture that allows educators to mock students for their background, that dismisses high expectations for certain children as a waste of time, and that ridicules a dedicated teacher for believing in them. He looked from Brenda to David and to the others who had participated in those lounge conversations. Their heads were bowed, their eyes fixed on the floor. They were not shocked by Lena's success anymore. They were shattered by the exposure of their own failure. Their reputations were not just damaged. They were obliterated. Effective immediately, Mr. Davies said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Several staff members will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full review by the school board. Our focus will now shift to mandatory cultural competency training and a complete overhaul of our professional development to address this. This profound failure of integrity. The meeting ended not with a bang, but with a suffocating silence. No one looked at anyone else. Teachers stood and filed out of the room like ghosts, their footsteps silent on the worn carpet. Brenda and David were the first to leave, rushing out with their heads down, avoiding every eye. Lena was the last to leave. Mr. Davies approached her, his expression a complex mix of apology and awe. Lena, I don't even know what to say. What you did with those kids, it was miraculous. Lena finally smiled, a genuine, peaceful smile. I just taught them, sir. I taught them to see the code and how to break it. She gathered her things. The revenge was complete. It was sweeter than she had ever imagined. She hadn't destroyed her enemies with accusations or fights. She had simply done her job with such blinding excellence that it held up a light to their own inadequacy. And in that brilliant, unforgiving light, their small, mean words had been captured for everyone to hear. They had condemned themselves. She walked out of the auditorium and down the quiet hallway. She passed the teacher's lounge, its door standing open, the room dark and empty. It would be a long time before anyone held a casual conversation in there again. Lena Jenkins walked out of the school into the afternoon sun, not as a victim, not as a suspect, but as the best teacher they had ever seen. And no one would ever dare mock her again.